The 2019 US Open begins on August 26th and represents the culmination of a grueling hard-court season. But what fun is the US Open if we can't speculate about it? And with the draw out now, we have everything we need for some predictions and discussions, which is what we do best. These are the 5 things you should watch for at the US Open. Number 1, Daniil Medvedev. The 23-year-old Russian was kind of an afterthought when it came to the next-gen stars, and we'll be getting to the rest of them. But he has absolutely torn up the US Tour before the US Open. He won his first Masters 1000 tournament in Cincinnati, which included a win over Novak Djokovic. He avenged his Wimbledon loss to David Goffin by beating him also at Cincinnati. He's made the finals of every US Open Tour tournament that he's played this year. He lost to Rafa and Nick Kyrios at the Rogers Cup and the City Open, respectively. This kid could be the real deal. Nothing about him on paper really jumps out at you as, oh, he's got a great serve, he's got a fantastic forehand, or something like that. He's just a consistent player, and he's been playing consistently well on the hard courts. He's a fantastic tactician. In his match against Novak Djokovic, he went with the first serve on his second serve. So as a result, he had a bunch of double faults, but he was able to actually ward off Novak's return. Of course, Novak is maybe the greatest returner of all time, and Medvedev was able to stymie him in that area of the match. If Medvedev can do that against some of the players that he'll have to beat in order to make a run deep into the US Open, you could see this kid really make a name for himself. I'm not saying he could win the thing, but I am saying that he is one of the next crop, one of the next generation of young stars to keep an eye on because of things like that. Number 2, Nick Kyrios. We put him on the list for a bit of a different reason. Where is his head going to be at?
The worst rep in the game. The worst. Hands down.
He had a very public outburst at Cincinnati, and in a match where he got eliminated, and you just don't know where he's going to be at. He's obviously a tremendously talented player, but where is he going to be mentally? Is he going to be in a state where he's ready to compete at the highest level at the US Open? He's had a feud with Rafa over serve clock and sportsmanship, but he's won 2 hardcore titles this year in Washington and Acapulco. The kid is talented. You can't deny that. Previously at the US Open, he's lost to Federer, Andy Murray, David Ferrer. Those are the type of performances that it takes to beat him. So if he's in a good state mentally, he could be looking at a quarterfinal run or deeper. But that's a big if, and it's certainly, if Cincinnati is anything to go by, the littlest things can set him off and make him lose a match. So we have to keep an eye on him as a guy who ceiling is about as high a ceiling as you can find, but man, if he's not there mentally, it's just not going to happen for him. Number 3, next-gen stars. The next generation of talent tend to do well at the US Open. It's late in the season, younger players are kind of hitting their stride, older players might be starting to succumb to fatigue, although that's a little bit less common now as guys start to play fewer warm-up tournaments, things like that. But in the previous few years, we've seen guys like 19-year-old Rublev, 22-year-old Lucas Pouille. They've made runs just totally out of nowhere. Let's take a look at a couple. I mentioned Nick Kyrios. Again, he tends to lose to really good players in the US Open, which means that he's going into the round of 32, round of 16 pretty consistently. Alexander Zverev for a long time has been the number 1 next-gen guy. He's had a bit of a lackluster year. He's got to pick it up. He's only won 1 title this year, and obviously that's more than a lot of players can say, but that's his fewest title win since his first season on tour. Denis Shapovalov, he's advanced to the round of 16 and the round of 32 in his only previous appearances. He's also had a bit of a lackluster year, so it's time for him to figure it out. Meanwhile, his countryman, Felix Auger-Aliassime, he's made only 1 US Open where he lost to Shapovalov, although he was forced to retire in that match due to a heart problem. He's back now. He's beaten some top players, seeded, number 18, and those two are playing in the first round again. Karen Khachanov lost to Rafael Nadal last year. He made a big run at Roland Garros this year. He's a really talented player. Dominic Thiem has 3 titles this year, including a hardcourt title at Indian Wells, which is a Masters 1000 tournament, and he's advanced to at least the round of 16. All but 1 year he's played at the US, made the finals of the French Open, and drew praise from the king of clay, Rafael Nadal. This could be a big year for Dominic Thiem, although he's kind of, at 25 years old, he's a little bit on the cusp of being called next gen. From him to one guy who certainly is next gen, Stefanos Tsitsipas. He's played only 2 matches at the US Open. He won his first round match last year, lost in the second round, but he was at the semis of the Aussie Open this year. The guy is talented, there's no doubt about that. So, and he tends to do well on hard courts, so this could definitely be a year for him. Borna Coric is an exceptional hardcourt player. That's where he specializes. He advanced to the round of 16, lost to Juan Martín del Potro last season, and if you lose to Del Potro, yeah, no real shame in that. A couple other guys that I can mention is Berrettini, who made a big run at Wimbledon, but he's only played 1 hardcore tournament so far this year. Taylor Fritz, the American, was a finalist in Atlanta and Mexico, and Alex de Minaur, winner in Sydney and Atlanta this year, as well as Riley Opelka, the only guy on tour that can look John Isner in the eyes without looking up. This kid, I think, is the real deal, more so than Isner. He's got a massive serve, but he varies his game up so much. The US Open could be the time for him to shine. At New York, we see the young guns. They really come into their own. The Flushing Meadows crowd gets behind him, especially the Americans, where really only for the last 7 or 8 years, we've only seen Frances Tiafoe really ignite the American crowd, maybe John Isner at times. By the way, all those guys I just mentioned outside of Opelka and Shapovalov are in the top 30. So the next gen may be now, and they may come out here at this US Open. Number 4, young Americans on the women's side. We talked about the next gen on the men's draw. Let's talk about the women's draw and the young Americans that we've seen. Stars like Sophia Kenin and Coco Gauff have really made their names this year. Amanda Anisimova is another one of those. Unfortunately, her father tragically passed away a couple days ago, so she's been forced to withdraw from the tournament. So, of course, our thoughts out to her. But man, there are some young Americans that look fantastic now, and for all of the struggles on the men's side to produce great American talent, the women's side is not having that problem. There are some players that could turn heads here. But of course, there are young players not from the US that can turn heads. 22-year-old Belinda Bencic at number 13, 19-year-old Bianca Andreescu at number 15 in the rankings. Andreescu also won the Rogers Cup. The women's draw has been absolute chaos for the last 2 years, and the US Open is just a funnel for that chaos. I mean, if you look at what happened last year, if you look at just the crowd and how loud they get, it's absolutely nuts what can happen. And so it's a perfect place for the young stars to make a name for themselves. And someone like Andreescu, this could be the time for her. There have been 35 different champions of WTA events this year. Only Simona Halep and Naomi Osaka have won multiple Grand Slams in the last 3 years. They've won 2 each. This field is about as open as any field could be, and I'm including the fact that Serena Williams is in this field. I still think that it's wide open for anyone, whether it's a young American or a young star from another country. This is shaping up to be one of the more fun US Opens on the women's side that we've seen in the last decade plus. Number 5, can Osaka return to form? Naomi Osaka was one of the absolute best stories in all of tennis at the end of last season and the beginning of this season. She won last year's US Open, this year's Aussie Open. Of course, last year's US was absolutely nuts, including in the final with Serena Williams. But after her Australian Open win at the beginning of this season, she's fallen off a little bit, and at her age, you expect that to happen. I mean, she is not a veteran. She lost in the first round of Wimbledon. She had to retire from Cincinnati, and that you would assume is more of a precautionary thing because Cincinnati is so close to the US Open. She hasn't made a tournament final since the Australian Open this year, and she's not a great clay court player, so that one kind of makes sense, I suppose. It's hard to place her among the rest of the women in the tour. When she's on, she's obviously one of the best, probably the best in the world. She's still ranked number one. But just like any younger player, especially one who's had so much recognition and has such a spotlight on her, she tends to be inconsistent. As far as her draw, I'm not going to say that she has an easy road, but the top player that she's looking at in her quarter right now is Belinda Bencic, I believe. And Bencic at number 13, we've mentioned, is a solid opponent. I think Osaka on her best day can beat her, and that, I believe, would be in the fourth round if they do meet. So it's open for Osaka to make a run, just like she did last year. It would be great for her to end her season on a high note like she did last season. Use that momentum to carry over. She is one of the more electrifying players on tour when she's at her best. Some bonus here for you. Let's talk about some of the better matches in the first round now that the draw is out. Let's start on the women's side, as Sofia Kenin, like I mentioned earlier, is taking on Coco Vandeweghe. Vandeweghe has had success at the US Open before. A rash of injuries has kicked her out of the rankings, so this is a big match for both of them. Kenin is having her best year of her career on American soil, trying to use that home crowd to her advantage. Coco Vandeweghe, also American, trying to use the home crowd to launch her back into prominence. So that's going to be a fun one. Sabalenka and Azarenka meeting, two Belarusian competitors. Azarenka, of course, former top 5 player. Sabalenka, a little bit inconsistent, but when she's on, she is definitely a top 10 player in the world. That's going to be a fun match. And then, of course, Serena, Sharapova. What more can you say? These two stars, a little bit past their prime, I think it's safe to say. But, of course, they're still two tremendous competitors, and a match that, as long as they're both playing, we're going to want to see it. There's no question about that. Let's switch over to the men's side. Let's begin with Berrettini and Gasquet. I mentioned Berrettini earlier. He's got a unique game that does fit well on the hard courts. Richard Gasquet has been around forever. It would be a huge win for Berrettini over the veteran. Fabio Fognini taking on Riley Opelka. Fognini, as you know, is like Nick Kyrios, except he's more aware of the fact that he turns off mentally. He's not a guy that's very popular on tour. Riley Opelka is going to be popular with the American fans. Fognini is seeded, of course, so this would be a big win for Riley Opelka if he's able to pick it up. But if Fognini is there mentally, he is a tremendous player. Taylor Fritz taking on Feliciano Lopez. Lopez has had a resurgence on the doubles court, but he is a veteran. He's been around for a long time. Another opportunity for a young American to make a statement against a great player like Lopez. Ivo Karlovic against Francis Tiafoe. Tiafoe, I keep saying this, as far as a young American, is a little inconsistent, but his game is there, and the fans love him at Flushing Meadows. This will be a big match for him, taking on a guy who has a similar play style and a guy whose style works, absolutely works, at Flushing Meadows in Karlovic. And finally, it's Herbert and de Minaur, two guys that have made statements in the past. Neither of them are seeded, but these are two guys. The winner of this match I could see going possibly to the third or fourth round, depending on how the rest of that draw shakes up. It's going to be fun to watch these two. We examined the numbers of every single cover star since Eddie George to see if we could find any trends. We examined just the 2 most important stats of every offensive player featured. We didn't track the stats of the 3 defensive players featured,